Welcome everyone, it's the Crypto Lark. Super excited to have back on the channel the ARCANE BEAR. Rawr. How's it going,
Oh,
man?
yeah, Mark, it's such a pleasure to be here again. I love our conversations together. It's been such a treat. And so thank you for inviting me back and building and furthering our relationship.
Yeah, it's an absolute pleasure. I mean, we're gonna be talking about some fun stuff today, guys. So we're gonna be talking about Bitcoin and Wall Street. We're also gonna be talking about conservation issues and entrepreneurship and all kinds of fun stuff. So make sure to stick around for the chat. It's gonna be a good one. Now let's just jump straight in. And how are you feeling about Bitcoin right now? As I think Backed came online like an hour ago or something like that. So how are you feeling about Bitcoin?
Well, I want to, as the months and years have gone by in my, I guess, experience in this space, one of the things I've started to realize is it's best to start off with a macro perspective, because that way you've got a nice view on what I think for the long term. And then we can get into more of the minutia of where I think we're headed in the next little while. So long term, I'm extremely bullish in this space. I think we could end up in anywhere of the hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars per Bitcoin very easily. The monetary system is broken, and this is an easy way to solve it. There's no scarcity in money printing. And if we start to come back to more where we are today, as you say, we're offering Backed. Now, I think one of the most interesting things about Backed is actually the institutional ability for people to have a way to securely store their keys as well. Like a lot of big investors, they're not holding their stocks in their house, not holding their gold in their house. They actually hire a third party like Brinks, or some of these, I guess they've got massive amounts of insurance behind them too. So I think one of the biggest things is that now institutional investors can have somewhere safe to store their keys. I mean, stories of people being robbed or tortured to give up their private keys. This isn't a really big selling feature for them specifically. And they've potentially had a lot of money for a long time, and they know the downside of being targeted for these such things. So I think one of the most unique things about Backed, aside from the institutional money being able to get in, is actually that custodial space that they're offering. And I think that's probably a lot of us, I agree with Trace Mayer in this: you don't own your keys, you don't own your wallet. But the same thing's with your house, technically. If I rent my house out on Airbnb and I give someone else my keys, do I really own my house for that moment? The deed's in my name, but if I show back up and they have guns, I don't have a whole lot of say in my house ownership anymore. So I think this custodial idea is actually often overlooked, and it's one of the biggest selling features for the institutional investors, because it now gives them the ability to own it without having to hold it securely. That insurance, those guns that reinforce that custodial space too, is also largely valuable. I mean, Brinks has done a great job of being able to store gold. Back in the day, I used to bank with Peter Schiff's Euro Pacific, and they have a gold storage. So they'll store your gold and your silver so that if you have like hundreds of ounces or whatever, I don't have to move that around. I can actually keep it in somewhere safe. And I think that's really important for these larger investors, because that's how they've been playing for their whole life. So although I'm obviously stressing the point of owning your own, having private ownership of anything is extremely important, being able to offer a custodial private ownership is as equally as important, because you don't want to be walking around with all this high value information to some degree or another. So if we zoom in a little bit closer, one of the things I think that is interesting, actually, let's do a little screen share here and let me know if this works properly. We'll go this screen. I'll do this really quickly. Okay, so I've got Bitcoin open on the, sorry, that was Raven. I've got Bitcoin open here on the 4-hour, and we've been following this triangle. So I'm sure all of you will recognize this triangle. But what I want to do now is grow to that macro perspective of where I think we're going in the long term. So right now, and for the last 2.5 months, I've said my particular opinion in technical analysis that we're going somewhere around here, which is the 200 day simple moving average. It's around $8,000 to $7,700 for Bitcoin. Now, I think we're going to go down. And one of the unique parts about pattern recognition, like this triangle we see here, we don't actually know which way it's going to break out. It's either going to break up or it's going to break down, one of the two. And it's going to happen probably right when we get to the end of this triangle, which is somewhere around the beginning of October. So I would assume that around the beginning of October, we're going to see either a big move downwards or upwards of around 20%. And then from there, this will indicate the next step. Now, the next step in my mind, because of these institutional investors getting in, is they're actually going to clamor over one another. And I think they're going to run the price up to around $50,000, this red line that I've drawn up here. Now, one of the reasons why I think we're going to run up really quickly is because you only have a few investors in this space that really understand what's going on. Like when you talk with, Anthony Pompliano, some of these guys that are helping institutions get in and understand the importance of Bitcoin, they're also a very small percentage of the large money that's out there right now. A lot of people that have a bunch of money, they don't necessarily care either to make more. Like if you're sitting on a few $1 billion, not like, oh yeah, I'm going to want to make a lot more. You're just concerned about managing what you have and growing it like a very little bit. So speculations like this aren't actually all that, let's say, sexy to the really, really big investors, or whether they're banks or I guess inherited wealth to some degree. So I think what we're going to see is a really sharp run up after this quick drop to around $50,000, and then the realization that the only people that got in, it'll be like 2017. You're going to see a big run up and then a very sharp spike down, probably to around $10,000. That's my current projections for the next year and a half. And it might actually go higher than $50,000 again too, because what we're dealing with is the value and the perception of value, which it's a man-made thing. The value is only by our perception. So if these institutional investors decide to have a higher perception of the value, maybe in the hundreds of thousands, I think we're gonna run up very, very sharp, very, very fast as they all clamor and stumble over one another like Black Friday to try to get in, and then they're gonna start dumping on one another when they realize that there's nobody else left in the market willing to buy it. Because unless we see something drastic in the I guess the fallout of the US dollar, Bitcoin is not going to get the legs that it deserves to go as high as it possibly can, because people are still going to be relying on the US dollar as the main or I guess worldwide currency. So until we see, and this is for the downside because this will hurt everyone essentially, until we see I guess some type of catastrophe in the financial system, Bitcoin's not going to do what it was designed to do in the long term, in the short term. So again, macro perspective, I'm very bullish. The system cannot keep going. How long it keeps going? Well, I thought we were done in 2016. So I was obviously way off. They can just keep printing it for a much, much longer than I thought.
Well, we've seen that right now. We're seeing that today, this very moment. They're printing unbelievable amounts of money. Remember, it was like 800 billion back in the 2008 GFC, right? And that was a lot of money, $800 billion, right? Now, best economy, everything's great, 750 billion to bail out the banks, because suddenly last week the banks all woke up and said what was totally normal last week, us trusting each other at the end of every day, like, you got enough money to cover that? Yeah, you got enough money? Yeah, that's all good. All of a sudden they woke up and said, we don't trust each other anymore. That guy doesn't have the money. I know he doesn't have money because I don't have the money either. And that guy definitely doesn't have money over there. And like, that is a real crisis, I think, that's kind of brewing in the background, that they've committed, I think, to $750 billion for just to bail out the overnight repo markets. That's one tiny obscure thing that nobody knew about. Just like the subprime mortgages. That was something tiny. It was niche. Nobody knew about it. And it brought the world as economy to a very dark place. And, lots of people lost their jobs. Lots of people lost their homes, all this kind of stuff. The question is, they just keep throwing money at these problems. And people keep accepting that a dollar for some reason is worth a dollar, even though it keeps being devalued over and over and over and over and over again. It's pretty crazy.
Yeah, it's a fascinating thing to I guess to really try to conceptualize, is the idea that nothing really has a value other than what we give it. Yep. And what's kind of blown my mind here is that, okay, if they're going to keep printing, they're printing because the real capital is actually locked up in people's minds when they come up with a new product or a new service, or the property that they own and they're turning into agricultural land and producing food for people. Real capital is actually locked up in the individual. And right now we've got some 7 billion people on the planet. And I think, and because I try to sometimes come up with a positive outlook on why or how this is happening. And because it felt like Wile E. Coyote ran off the cliff probably in 2008 when the banks failed the first time. And then since then, because nobody looked down, they've been running a huge facade. The economic system is disastrously sick. It's not functioning in any way, shape, or form. And a lot of times, if you actually look at the Fed's QE book, the rise of the stock market is pretty much directly correlated to how much money that they've been printing. So, for me, what I've been trying to, lack of a better word right now, say meditate on, is how come this money is still being accepted. And I think it's because that intellectual capital, you know, you listen to people like Peter Diamandis, some of the futurist guys, their stipulation is that there's around 4 billion people on the planet right now that still don't have access to general education or information as we know it today, and that they're the real resource that we're trying to unlock. So what I've been trying to imagine is this extra money printing able to go until we can unlock that real hidden capital that's in the hearts and the minds of the people that produce new products and services? And does this game have a lot longer to go than I had originally anticipated based off just the printing? Because if all those other people kind of need to figure out the problems too, that's a lot of people that don't yet know. So we might be even still a few more years away from seeing a total destruction. Now, to circle back around to what you're saying, these banks turning and not trusting each other, I think what we're likely going to see is the failure of small, not market cap, but small countries' capitalizations based off their internal monies versus the US dollar. Mm-hmm. So that their particular countries are doing the same thing. Venezuela's printing money, right? Turkey's printing money. Cyprus, they are printing money. So
Argentina,
if they're all
we're already seeing it.
So I think we're going to see these individual bursts of economic failures in very almost isolated places. Like, right, if you don't live in Venezuela, you can't tell how bad things are because it's a very isolated area of the world in terms of economic development. And they were not an underdeveloped country. I have friends that you know escaped there. These were doctors, entrepreneurs. These are very intelligent, very well-educated people. So if those people still ran into the same problems, I think it's just a matter of time until it ends up hitting the United States. And I think the United States dollar will be the very last economy to blow up and probably the worst place to be during that, because almost everywhere else will have experienced some type of economic crisis to begin with. Like here in Bali, you know, I think 1 million rupees is like 100 American dollars. And that's technically an economic crisis. But the difference here is people's value and the perception of the life that they live is they're happy. And I think this idea of gratitude and perceiving the value of life itself actually creates a more stable economy, because instead of just wanting and wishing for more stuff, they've become grateful and I guess, yeah, accepting of what they have. And it creates some sort of stability based off, again, that perception of value.
The need for more stuff is almost like a sickness in a way, right? You have to just find that place to be happy with what you have and, you know, appreciate probably that there's a massive amount of things you can be grateful for in your life already. And you brought up a really interesting point about unlocking these billions of people that are totally non-existent in the modern global economy to those billions more that are underserved by the modern global economy. And I remember when I first, years and years and years ago, reading books about economics and stuff and thinking, wow, one of the worst things about, you know, global wealth inequality and crony capitalism, all this stuff, was that you've got all these young kids, like, you know, you got, you know, a kid in India who's never going to have the chance to be Einstein because he didn't have the opportunities, but he had the brain to do it. He just didn't have the opportunities because he ended up dying at the age of 5 from diarrhea they didn't have to die of because of the bad economic state, or, you know, some kid in wherever else who just didn't get the education or didn't have the opportunities or whatever it might be. And like, as a global human society, we are really missing out by all this innovation and knowledge that could be unlocked as people get more tools into their hands. That's one of the things that excites me so much about the entire cryptocurrency space, is that we are unlocking tools for people. Bitcoin is a tool. You know, 20 years ago, trying to send money to, I don't know, let's say the Central African Republic would be a nightmare. And probably still a nightmare if you try to use the traditional banking system. If you do it with Bitcoin, boom, it's done in a matter of minutes. That's revolutionary, and that's just one tiny use case for cryptocurrencies. So my question to you, and we can follow up on any of the stuff from there you want to, but my question to you is, outside of Bitcoin, what do you see as being some of the most important cryptocurrencies that are not Bitcoin?
Well, you know, it's the answer here is actually going to be kind of funny, because I believe it's variations of Bitcoin. I think the blockchain technology is extremely valuable unto itself. And if we look at that idea of capital, whether it's intellectual property or physical property itself, I'll try to explain this in a roundabout way. a lot of old time war tactics was to actually aim directly at the houses of registry for the people that own private property. Because private property and private ownership unto itself is actually kind of the birthplace of money having value. Because that means if I own something, you can come buy it off me and I can give you that real capital. Like money's use case is to have a product or a service end up in your hand. So one of the ideas I've been following really closely, well, it's actually two of them, and they work somewhat in conjunction if you do a deep dive and read between the lines, is a token called Raven and Flow. Now, Flow we'll leave off the table for a sec. We'll just focus on Raven. Raven is basically what I call in our private membership area, we call a baby Bitcoin, which means that it's a fork of Bitcoin's original code that has a bunch of extra features built on top. Now, the argument could be that, oh, well, why don't you just build it on a Bitcoin? It's like, well, why, do you really want to add more risk? If you look at just the concept of distributed anything, it's removing risk from one area to another so that you don't have a central fail point for any particular idea. So Raven allows you to create assets on top of each token. So if you own a certain amount of Raven tokens, you can do what's called an asset generation event, which means you create like a micro security essentially. So I could be like, okay, for instance, as an example, my property in Costa Rica is owned by a corporation, and that corporation has a certain amount of shares. So if I wanted to sell a part of my property, I would just divvy up the shares and write it out on the lot which these shares are worth, and I would give the shares to the next owner, essentially, right? So even nowadays, we're using, I guess, a type of securitized ability to give someone that part of that private ownership through shares in a company, essentially, right? So Raven gives you the ability to be able to do that with private property, and more, I think more even interestingly, is to the security space. Now, this is the other really interesting spot, is that people are like, oh, the stock market. It's like the important part to remember is that business has been on the planet for a really long time, and businesses are the reason why we need money, is because they have a product and service that you want. So the other important part is actually the ownership of these companies. So even though I'm not a big fan of the way the stock market works currently, being able to own equity in companies is an extremely valuable idea, because now you own a part of someone's intellectual property or intellectual capital. So these Einsteins that have created something that we all think are valuable, we can take part of and own their idea and support them in their mission statement, essentially, right? It's kind of what the stock market represents in a very loose term. So Raven's created a platform that allows you to, again, own property or intellectual capital, such as businesses and equity in those businesses, by a secondary generation of tokens. Now, the real interesting line here, I think, is when you start to do the deep dive. There's a company that's been released lately. It's in Medici Ventures portfolio called T0. And T0 is the very first regulated securities exchange to not just trade cryptocurrencies, but to be able to use something like Raven to have, let's say, if you were to put Microsoft's stock, their entire stock option trades, derivatives onto a cryptocurrency blockchain. Now, this is massive amounts of, again, locked up capital in trillions of dollars in the regular market space. So I think more so than just the money space, we need to actually find these other tokens that are able to basically eat up the stock market or the property or the real estate sectors. So Flow and Raven, I'll just leave Flow as just the name if you guys want to do your own research. It's another baby Bitcoin. It's a fork of Bitcoin from back in 2012. It's known as Florin Coin. It's got something known as the Open Index Protocol, which is basically like the Google of transaction history. And they're using that almost as a receipt record for T0 as well. As far as I can tell, again, this is all conjecture. Medici doesn't say anything about this upfront, and specifically, you have to go through and do a bunch of digging to try to find any of this on your own. And it's not easy. And there's a reason for it. Is because it's not up and running yet. Part of the big regulatory hurdles for companies like T0 is to make everything legit. So it's taken them a long time, and it's been a big investment. And for them, Floor and Raven are already decentralized assets. They can never be hit as securities. And that was an extremely important part. There was no fundraise for any of these proof of work tokens back in the, and they've been running for a long time. There's a lot of hashing power behind them still. Obviously not at the level to which Bitcoin is. But again, this comes down to more of an argument. It's like, well, you know, again, it's actually extremely valuable to own private property. If you take that away, money is worthless to some degree, because now I have no product, service, or valuable asset to trade you for this supposed value transfer. So for me right now, I think some of the most exciting spaces here are variations of what Bitcoin can do, but that are aimed at eating up an entirely different part of the market. I forget who said it, but it was essentially the idea that this space, whether it's blockchain or variations of consensus, and again, I think distributed is probably the most valuable portion of the like philosophical concept. You ask yourself, well, what does distributed mean? It means that one body that holds too much power is almost always vulnerable because of that centralized source. So if you have one space that holds all these other values, it actually it's a danger and a risk to have all these assets conglomerated together. So I think private ownership of equity in companies, as well as private ownership of properties going onto the blockchain, is massively undervalued because it goes back to that same sentiment. You don't own your keys, you don't own your home. If you don't own your deed, you don't own your property. And if you don't own if you can't own deeds securely, safely, and transfer them, then what good is money anyway? So I think all of these sectors are going to be eaten up by these distributed areas that are a hell of a lot more secure than anything, and even more importantly, transparent. You know, one of the big things about the stock market, we go into these talks about derivatives and the silver rigging and the gold rigging that's been taking place. We don't actually know what's happening because no one is really privy to access this type of information easily. And these distributed blockchain ledgers give everyone access to that information and make it immutable. So you can't just go in and screw with it if you want to. And so
it's like the Wizard of Oz currently. You're meant to believe there's some magical wizard out there who knows better and is taking care of everything.
Yeah, so those are probably the most two exciting ones for me because I'm not a maximalist. I think this technology will eat up probably every sector that we have in the technology space is going to find a portion of itself within these distributed ledger systems because it just brings more value to the table.
It's very interesting, actually. I really feel like the use cases are something that you've got to find a good use case. You know, if you're just trying to be a slightly faster, slightly cheaper value transfer, well, there might be a place for that. But when you have Bitcoin with the Lightning Network on top of it, you're going to have some pretty gosh darn hard competition in terms of trying to be the money of the cryptocurrency space, right? But if you can find use cases outside of that, right? You're going to be the smart contract platform where people can build decentralized finance, right? And Ethereum's kind of locking that down right now. Or you can be the platform where you're going to have different assets like deeds or properties or whatever it might be. And actually the deed thing is really important because you brought up a great point. If you don't have your deed to your property, you can't really prove you own it. And even then, you can't always prove that you own it necessarily, especially if you're counting on, I don't know, your local government office to have it. I can't remember the exact statistic. I'm pretty sure it's like 1 in 3 people in the world cannot prove that they own the land that they live on. And that is crazy in terms of not being able to unlock your capital value. You can't take a loan against your house and all that stuff. Not you should necessarily be doing that, but you can't do it anyway. But also there's a real problem with corruption in a lot of places. You're in Indonesia right now, and it's a country that has suffered from a long history of corruption, and particularly around the expansion of the palm oil plantations, because people have lived on certain parts of land for generations. They don't have a piece of paper that says they can do that. Or if there is a piece of paper that says that they have the right to live there, they may not be the ones in possession of that. That might be at their local government office. Palm oil baron comes in, gives a little bit of money to somebody to make a piece of paper disappear, bada bing, bada boom, you don't own your property anymore. That has happened countless times around the world. People have been disenfranchised from their own land due to corruption. Now, this actually kind of segues into our next conversation here, which, you know, crypto's amazing. We love crypto. We talk about it all the time, obviously. Conservation is another place that I have got a lot of passion for. And I think that there's a lot of great synergies between what's being built in the cryptocurrency space right now, as well as working with conservation. I mean, something from what we just talked about with, you know, being able to prove your land and not having, you know, exploitative palm oil barons come and take over your property and destroy your rainforest and all that stuff. That's part of it, without a doubt. But what are some of the most important conservation issues for you right now?
Okay, well, I love this topic because you know, this is this little blue planet is our home. Aside from the internal value of perception, we all need to be able to survive in this place. And there's a lot of industries that have been able to take advantage of these smaller governments and these disenfranchised peoples and their property because of that. You know, Peru has some prime examples of this. And these big companies are fined pennies for the destruction that they're creating. So I think what's most interesting in the crypto and the space to be able to help solve some of these problems is, again, the decentralized version of governance. Now, I'm going to just I have to for a second talk shit about the word consensus because it's not all that valuable. We were in consensus about the world being flat for a very long time. So consensus isn't necessarily a truth or a fact. It just means that a bunch of people agree together, and people are not always privy to being right. So you might have a bunch of, you might be wrong often. So consensus isn't actually the greatest form of finding out the truth. There are much better, scientific method has found out a better way, which is trying to be wrong, but that's a whole nother side topic. So in the consensus algorithms, you know, what's interesting is that we can have, for the first time, I think we're going to see a lot smaller scale governance start to come in. So instead of having these really big top-down governments that can go in and cause all these problems, I think governance itself is actually going to become more distributed as well.
Yeah.
Now, again, you don't want to run this on Bitcoin. You want to be able to create secondary ways for people to vote for whatever municipal laws they want. I mean, let's take, okay, so we'll use where I grew up as an example, because it's a very, very abstract place. I grew up in Canada in a little place called Nelson. And in Nelson, British Columbia, they had been growing ganja there for a long time, longer than ganja was illegal. So when the police force moved into Nelson, which was the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, they no longer exist there. So everywhere you go in Canada, aside from the native reserves, you have what's known as the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. They are the RCMP. They're like the police force that abides by the federal laws of the Canadian government. But in Nelson, you don't have this. You have a private police force, because when they got there, they realized everyone was growing ganja. They were up high in the mountains, so they had strategically advantageous locations, and they were well armed and well funded. So what do? You don't try to start a war with your own people. They found a treaty, a peace truce, essentially. So this was like a small scale municipal government's choice to be like, okay, well, instead of starting a municipal war with people that are like, instead of going out and killing a bunch of Canadians for growing a plant, let's just find a way to like ease this conversation. It's like, as long as you're not screwed. So you have a private police force, and they've been growing ganja in Nelson, British Columbia the whole time, knowingly. And this is, I think, what's important about understanding this idea here is that this community deserves the ability to choose what they want to do. And because they were well armed and well funded, the government didn't have much choice but to kind of bend the knee to them. And in this particular space, I think the ability to have municipal governance is important, because some people are going to have different viewpoints. If these people want weed to be legal, that's what it should be. If these people don't, cool, that's probably what it should be. And if you don't want to live where it's not legal, don't go live there. You can go live somewhere else. So I think top-down governments in the crypto space is a huge thing. And the other one that's really important, and I'm going to bring up a topic here that a lot of people probably won't like, is actually LibreCoin. Now, it's not that I like LibreCoin, but what I did like is that Facebook included a company called Kiva. And if any of you know what Kiva is, it's a small, they do microtransactions or micro loans for people in third world countries. So you can invest in someone that's got their own like wool business in India, and you can give him like $1,000 and he'll pay you back on this Kiva platform. It was a revolution. It won awards for all sorts of things. But one of the big problems for Kiva is, as you said, is these the transaction fees. These the remittance fees to get money from us to them. It's like, well, maybe it only costs me $3, but for them that $3 might be
day and a half's wages, 2 days' wages. Exactly. That's it.
It's different between affording food for your family and not. So I think in the remittance space, crypto offers us the opportunity to really provide value to one another. And again, I'm just going to go out on a limb here and argue against the maximalists and say that if you told me I had to use Bitcoin and only Bitcoin, that's still considered fiat. Fiat means by decree of the king. So if you think you're a king and you're telling other people what they have to use, that's still fiat. Although, mind you, it doesn't have the inflationary problems of the current fiat we have. It still has the intrinsic problem of you telling someone else what it is they have to use.
Exactly. And I think if you and I want to send a Litecoin transaction to each other, well, what's the problem?
Yeah, exactly. I think that choice is one of the most valuable aspects that brings to the space. So I know that's not really, it doesn't really have to do with conservationism, but when we help the little guy, the disenfranchised, the people at the bottom, we start to unlock that intellectual capital that creates and generates the new technologies that help us solve these problems that we're going to. And the other important thing, I think, is just a wave of conscious capitalism. As an entrepreneur, I think people are more and more starting to realize that you should be starting a business, and you can incorporate that spiritual feel-good idea of being in service to others.
Yeah.
And that's such an inspiring spot for me. It's the only reason why I've become vocal and excited about this space. Otherwise, I would have stayed living in the jungle, is that I feel for the first time in a long time, we can actually catch that wave of being in service to one another and the planet and make a lot of money while doing it.
We're going to come to entrepreneurship here in a couple minutes, but I actually think that what you've just said is incredibly important for conservation issues, because if we look around the world, what are some of the major reasons why we have problems with conservation issues, right? It's lack of governance, not government, governance, right? People being able to make their own decisions. And I'm a massive proponent for the idea that you and I and the guy next door and the guy down the street and the guy on the other side of town, we're actually smart enough to make decisions. Voters are apathetic for a reason. You know, in most major democracies, people only show up, only half the population or less shows up. And it's not because people are inherently not interested in politics or whatever. They're apathetic because they know that no matter who they vote for, that the same corporate interests are going to buy those people and are going to sell everybody out. Why would you even bother going to vote in a lot of these situations? Whereas you and I, we're not dumb. We can make decisions, right? We can have conversations. We can debate issues. We can do that as a society. And then we can all, on the blockchain, have, you know, referendums to decide, well, where should we go? What are some of the things that we should do? And maybe you still need some kind of a judiciary branch to ensure that, you know, well, okay, great. You know, if that small town in Canada wants to grow some cannabis, that's not hurting anybody, right? But if another small town wants to, I don't know, institute child labor laws, you know, so that 5-year-olds can work in sweatshops, well, maybe we have the judiciary come in and say, hey, guys, that's, you know, there's a set of rules everyone agreed to. And that's, you know, a lot of conversations. It's a difficult thing overall. But I think that as a human society, we can actually do that, because conservation often falls down based on lack of governance, so lack of the government or whatever governing structures be able to protect the environment or people against the greed of corporations, which is what we largely see happening. And so if we can have that system in place, I think it'll be a very net positive for conservation issues, actually. So I think it's definitely connected. Now, I want to move on to talking about entrepreneurship, because this is something that you and I are both passionate about building businesses and all this stuff. So just maybe share some of your thoughts, you know, on how you see entrepreneurship coming into the crypto space.
First off, for the last few years to me has been revolutionary. I was kind of, let's say, I had a very sour taste in my mouth from what I saw from capitalism when I was younger. But as I've gotten older, I've realized there's a lot of untold stories of entrepreneurs who follow that line of being in service to others. And this is one of those ideas where it actually has a lot of, again, for lack of a better word right now, spiritual connotations to the idea of providing something valuable to your fellow man, whether it's a product or a service. And as I started to realize that just being in service to others is not only rewarding financially, but it's rewarding by bringing purpose and meaning into your life. It makes you a herald of your community, because people recognize that you're offering them something that's valuable to them. It really changed my outlook on the future of where we're going, because I think so many of the times in the news, what we see is all the bad stuff that happens, but they don't tell us about the guy who made $1 billion from seaweed and helped change all these laws in Indonesia for having tighter regulations and structures for the and this is, I mean, this, we could get into some very abstract conversations here, but a lot of these big companies that have done well, they've actually done well because they're providing something very valuable to the community, and they've been some of the front runners for bringing in these lobbying for good, actually, right? It's not all lobbyists are lobbying for bad ideas. These guys are actually trying to make the laws for the better by making sure that recycling, or the way garbage is dealt with, is actually put into a higher category of importance for the governments. So as I started to see more of those stories, it started to inspire me to be like, oh, business isn't just about making money off other people. It's about providing something valuable to your community. And I guess that in a very short sentiment, that alone has changed my life. You know, one of my business mentor started with $500 and ended up the company now does around $9 billion a year in annual revenue. And to see that you can take something that's got those spiritual connotations and provide yourself a lot of value, but at the same time provide others value. You're bringing them consistent jobs. They were part of, again, people get down on Starbucks, but they were the people that started the fair trade agreements that said that even though you charge less for your coffee here in Chile, we're going to pay you more, because across the board, it's better for everyone that way for us to do so. And they started to create standards of trade. So a lot of these big, I mean, that was actually Starbucks' main pitch for a bunch of years, was we created fair trade. And that's why they exploded, is because they were the first producers of coffee to pay people more than what they were asking for, instead of just trying to undercut their competitors. And they built a lot of their whole campaign and their business culture too. So the people that they hired that worked for that company, they were inspired by this business culture. So for me, I guess in short, and we'll leave it kind of short, is that being in service to others is extremely rewarding. And it's not just personally, it can be often financially as well.
Absolutely. Building is amazing, and getting out there and providing things for people that have good impact. And this is, I think, where capitalism gets a lot of negative assumptions, is that people mistake crony capitalism for how capitalism could be, right? We could talk about maybe compassionate capitalism or something like that, right? Yeah. But definitely when you see the crony system and you realize how deeply broken and corrupt and unserving that is to the wider scope of humanity, that's got problems, right? And there's companies that exist within a whole range of being totally broken and exploitative and environmentally destructive and terrible with labor and all this stuff, to companies that are trying their damnedest in the current system to provide fair wages to people and to be transparent. And I actually think, again, if we bring this back to the blockchain context, we're going to see increasingly customer awareness being taken to the next level, because imagine now if you can just scan a product and actually see on the blockchain verifiably that, hey, this was grown on this farm, which has certifications that, you know, everything there was pesticide free and they didn't have to cut down any orangutan homes to do this. And you can actually see that verifiably as a customer. People care a lot more than, I don't know, sometimes other people might like to think that they care, but people do. People do. If people were to go out and buy something and they know, hey, that purchase, you know, came from slave labor and Amazon destruction, they may not be so keen to buy it when there's an option sitting right next to it that didn't do that. And so that kind of transparency, I think we can start bringing in as we build out these distributed systems.
Yeah, and I guess just to kind of full circle the thought there for myself, into the idea of being an entrepreneur in this particular space, it's akin to being an entrepreneur in the early 1990s of the internet space. Mm-hmm. You know, we're looked at as kind of the crazies, but it's very valuable to be here. And any industry that has chaos in it can be extremely lucrative. You just need to find out where the chaos is and try to help solve some of the chaos that the industry is having. You know, I think, you know, it's why I'm such a big fan of the work that, you know, yourself and all the other great voices on YouTube. We're helping try to explain some of the chaos that's currently taking place and bring awareness through the communication of value about what's going on, because we're not given that information of like, hey, you should just be investing every month like $50 or whatever. It doesn't matter whether it's at a high or a low. Just keep investing, because in 10 years from now you're gonna be doing really well. Yep. So there's a lot of simple concepts that we were never taught that I think as an entrepreneur, and from like in just in general to being specific as an entrepreneur in the crypto space, there's so much chaos here. And I don't know if this is actually true or not, because I haven't done my due diligence, but I believe at least that the Chinese word for opportunity is very similar, or if not identical, to the Chinese word for chaos. And it's because out of these moments of confusion, if you bring a solution to the table, it is very, very valuable for the community. And it's just another way to be in service to others, is by offering these solutions. And, you know, I think not to sound callous or I guess even sexist, but for women as well, this space is ripe for people that are better at being social. You know, there's not a whole lot of people that are actually all that good at being social in this space, because it is the tech sector. And women are almost, and again at the risk of sounding offensive, women are almost unanimously across the board better at being social with one another than men are. So there's a lot of chaos in this sector where you can come in and you can help alleviate the communications troubles in this space right now by being a good communicator. And that's extremely valuable for for people. And I think the other important part too is to recognize that because we're so early on, we're going to have ripple effects that, again, I think, as I said in the beginning, I think this space is going to eat up every sector. To be here this early, you're almost a guaranteed success at some point if you just keep showing up.
Just keep showing up. That's right. Yeah. That's right. Well, it's the ability to have the hindsight, right? For if it's sitting in here in 2019, if only I had known more about the internet back in 1995. It's 1995. It's in cryptocurrency land. Act accordingly. Like we know, we can look back at the revolutionary technology that the internet brought. We can look at how revolutionary the potential for blockchain technology is in the wide range of cryptocurrencies, which are in the cryptocurrency space right now. Obviously, a lot of those will fall by the wayside, just the way that the dot-com era, ruined a whole lot of ideas. But those ideas, even the failures, had value because they proved that those were not working economic models or whatever it might be. But we are early. We are in a very, very exciting time in cryptocurrency land.
Yeah. No, the ability to not make someone else's mistakes can save you a lot of money. It's a very important part that these failures exist. I think a lot of the time when people are like, oh, look, Donald Trump went bankrupt. It's like, yeah, that's because he knew to some degree what he was doing. Not to give Donald Trump any praise or anything, but let's just focus more on the idea of bankruptcy. Lots of people go bankrupt. Lots of very, very successful people went bankrupt a few times before, because that's a general part of business, to be able to take out loans, not against yourself, but against the idea that you're trying to build, because it might fail. But to everybody in the community, it's actually valuable to earn that information. It's almost like looking at a war veteran and be like, oh, look at you, you lost an arm. It's like, yeah, they were fighting for something that they believed in. That's a pretty important thing to do. What are you doing? Are you losing limbs trying to build shit for other people? Like, we should give them more respect when they fail.
Failure is a part of the process. And I think it's so important to accept failure, and when it happens, to learn the lessons from failure, to say, hey, you know what, that taught me an important lesson, or to look at someone else's failure and say, is there a lesson that I can learn personally from that person's experience? Because that stuff has got incredible value. It's not failing. We don't fail when we fail. We fail when we don't learn from failure. Everyone's going to fail at some point. It's about the lessons that you take away from that. It's about how you become better as a result of those situations. If you've never failed at anything before, well, then you're failed at failing. So welcome to failure.
Yeah. You're not trying hard enough if
you're not trying damn hard enough. Exactly.
Yeah, it's a really hard thing to get used to. But once you do, I had I guess I'm going to call it the privilege of being able to study music when I was younger. So I very, very quickly learned that failure is what you're going to find most of the time, and that mastery is no short leap to make. It's going to take you a minimum 10 to 35 years to become someone who's good at what you're doing. So for the first 10 years of any musical instrument is mostly failure. And it's like, sounds bad, people are looking at you weird, like, dude, you make cat scratch McGee. So I think because I had early years in getting over bad sounding failures, I was like, okay, great, let's just keep moving, and let's just keep focusing on the end result here, which is 25 to 35 years in the future. Mm-hmm. So, with anyone that's new to this space, one of my favorite quotes is, if you're trying to get rich quick, that's the fastest way to go broke. Yep. Or something like people try to ask, what's the quickest way to get rich quick? I'm like, I don't know, but I can tell you the fastest way to go broke, and that's by trying to get rich quickly.
That's it. That's so true. You got to have that long-term thinking in mind here. It's amazing. It's amazing what you can do in 5 years or 10 years, for example, but if you're trying to have a 10-year result in 7 days, it's probably not going to happen for you, right? Yeah. Somebody might win the lottery, right? But even those people, look at the suicide rates amongst lottery winners, right?
Yeah, very unsustainable. Yeah, there's money does not equal happiness. To go back to the idea of gratitude, money only solves money problems. Yep. Your ability to be excited and be grateful for the sunset that you're watching, like we all have the same sunset. It's your ability to appreciate it that really brings the value to the table.
I love this beautiful quote. It's basically man's one of the only animals out there that has the ability to make any heaven into a hell and any hell into a heaven, right? It's all the head game. If you want to perceive, there's all these rich people with so much monetary abundance, right? But they have absolute spiritual wastelands going on where they're not happy, they're miserable, and they're out, getting drunk and doing affairs and all kinds of crazy stuff, trying to fill that void of emptiness spiritually that they have. Oh yeah, sure, you've got 3 new cars sitting in your driveway, but who cares? You only drive one of them at a time, and you can't take them with you when you die.
Yeah, exactly. There's a lot to be learned from. Again, religion is a bad word, I think, nowadays, but religion to me is just something that you get up, you do daily. I've been more and more, I wake up, and I don't do it for very long. Maybe it's 10 or 15 minutes where I just try to breathe, do a little stretching, and I try to remind myself, like, shit's okay, right? You're valuable. Other people are valuable. Like, it's good to be here, because it's so easy to be, to get caught up and be depressed with the way it appears that the world is going. And again, a large amount of where we go is where we choose to think we are right now. So gratitude is probably one of the most important investments anyone can make into themselves. Is just keep reminding yourself that you're like that this is worth it. And if it's not, choose something else. Otherwise you're going to regret it later on.
That's right. I mean, just the fact that for anyone who's made it this far into our conversation, just the fact that you have a computer, you're able to sit here and watch a video streaming on YouTube, you've already won the lottery, guys. You have. Globally, you've already won the lottery. Now it's the question of what you do with that abundance, that base of abundance, which you already have. And chances are, if a lot of you are interested in cryptocurrency investing, well, you already have a lot to be grateful for. If you have money to invest in cryptocurrencies, you should have a lot to be grateful for. And if you are investing in cryptocurrencies, you should have a lot to be grateful for, because gosh darn it, Bitcoin to the moon!
Yeah.
Anyway, we've been chatting for a while now, so I think let's finish up our conversation there, mate. It's been just absolute pleasure as always having you on and just sharing ideas and talking about crypto and the world. So thank you so much for taking some time out of your busy schedule to sit down and have a chat with me.
Yeah, I love it. To all the Crypto Lark family, thank you guys so much. Keep supporting this wonderful man. He's brilliant. I've been so I love watching the growth of my fellow man, and I'm not, again, to not hopefully sound pious or anything. I'm proud to see how well you're doing with your channel, and so hats off to you. Remember to give this man a thumbs up. Leave him some fantastic comments. He deserves all the best. And go check out his. Sorry, I hope that was.
No cheese, Lark Steve. Cheese. Awesome, mate. Thank you so much.
Yeah, have a great day, brother. We'll see you again soon. Again, just thank you for all that you do in the space.
Thank you.